as a starting point, I'm hoping you'd be willing to just take some time and set the stage for the conversation tonight by talking about how you came to write this book and why now, what you hope to accomplish, and maybe to highlight some of the key themes as a starting point.
First of all, thank you very much, Randy, for your very kind introduction and generous introduction. I have known Randy for many, many years. We used to go to Starbucks coffee shop for years, somewhere between 7:30 to 8:30 every single day. And I remember I used to talk about writing a book. That was about 10, 11 years ago. And he has not only been a good friend, a good colleague, he is exceptionally talented and wise. And I am honored to have a friend like you, Randy. So thank you very much for being here and for having supported me throughout my academic career. And I want to thank all of you for coming here today and for encouraging me to write and to organize conferences like this one here today. The idea of writing this book came about 8 or 9 years ago when I was doing a lot of interviews about Iranian foreign policy, especially about the civil war in Syria. And the question that I really wanted to answer in this book, the questions were essentially three major questions I tried to answer in this book. Question number one is, what kind of strategy, what kind of method did Iran use to become a major power in the Middle East? Now, when I say major power, I'm not praising what Iran is doing, nor am I condemning what Iran is doing. I leave that to the preachers, to the political activists. My job is to explain. So I am not attaching any positive or negative point about Iranian rise. But the fact is that until about 5-6 years ago, Iran had become a more influential player in Iraq, in Syria, in Lebanon, in Yemen, and in the Gaza Strip than at any time in the past 200 years of its history. For good or for bad, whether you agree with it or not, it's irrelevant. Whether you think Iran made a mistake or not, it's irrelevant to the question I have. So the first question was, how did Iran manage this? Then the second question that is related to the first question, how the hell did Iran, a medium-sized power, how the hell did Iran was able to expand its power despite having an anti-American ideology, anti-Israel ideology, and most importantly, despite 4 decades of economic sanctions by the US. If any of you have ever traveled to Cuba, you can see what sanctions does to a country. Now, if you go to Iran, you see that there are countries that can defy that sanctions. So the second question, how did Iran manage its anti-American policies and defy US sanctions? And the final question I answer, which is the key, can Iran sustain what it has gained in the Middle East in the past 2 decades? So how did Iran become a power? How did Iran manage its anti-Americanism? And can Iran sustain its power? Let me start with the last part, and then we can start our conversation. Let me give you my conclusion. There are some of you here who have taken my classes. You know how I operate. I tell everybody, if you cannot summarize your thought in a few lines, you don't have a thought. So I'm going to see if I can pass my exam, my own test. My main argument is that the essence of the fight between the US and Iran over the past 46 years has nothing to do with human rights, has nothing to do with the format, the structure, the structural configuration of the Iranian state. It has to do with one thing: power. Because power, in my judgment, is the mother milk of international relations. And international relations is nothing but the pursuit of power, protection of one's interest, and protection of one's security. So the Cold War that we've had between the US and Iran is caused by the fact that Iran seeks to expand its power, and the United States, as the preeminent world power, tries to stop Iran from expanding. But Iran managed to expand its power. However, I argue at the end that this power is not sustainable. It is not sustainable because A, Iran tried to expand its power through support for non-state actors, or what they call proxies. It is not sustainable because Iran's relationship with most of the countries in the Middle East is based on security and military relationship. It is not based on economic relationship. And most importantly, it is not sustainable because Iranian ambition is much more powerful than Iranian capability. In other words, Iran is overplaying its hand. And at the very end of the book, I make the following observation: that the Shah of Iran lost its throne, the peacock throne, in 1979, when Iranian power was at its peak. The reason why he was overthrown is because domestically he had problems. And I make the same argument today, that the greatest threat to the sustainability of Iranian rise is that the Iranian state, the Islamic Republic of Iran, has lost considerable support, and the bulk of the Iranian population, which is young, educated, highly wired, is not going to accept the kind of regime we have in Iran. That is the summary of my book. So those of you who have bought the book, please go ahead and return it, because I've already told you what the book is all about.
Thank you. That's great. One of the things that struck me about the book is how meticulously researched it is. I did not count your references, but I am well aware there must be over 1,000 of them.
Yes, they are.
And with such a deep dive into these topics, I'd be interested, before we get into the specifics of countries and actors, was there anything that surprised you or that may have reshaped your own thinking about an issue that you had going in?
Yes, there are over 1,000 citations. And I have to tell you, they say that Ernest Hemingway, who is one of the greatest American writers of all time.
Next to Mohsen Milani.
Well, thank you so much. That's why I admire you. They say Ernest Hemingway, who is one of the most talented natural writers of all time, used to edit his stories sometimes up to 100 times. This is a natural writer. So what I did, and Ramak was sitting right there, can testify to that. Sometimes she would go nuts. She would say, "You rewriting this again?" I say, "Yes." Because my goal was to write it in a way that you don't have to read it twice to understand what I'm saying. You could disagree with what I say, but at least you can understand what I say. I have a simple philosophy, and those of you who have taken any classes with me can testify to that. Simple writing is a sign of a cohesive mind. Convoluted writing, convoluted speaking is a sign of a confused mind. You write because you want to communicate with people. Why do you make it so difficult for people to understand? So I did a lot of rewriting and rewriting and rewriting. Here is the greatest surprise I had. which is going to surprise you too. And I haven't even written it about it. And that is, there is a huge disparity of power between the United States and Iran. And I talk about it in chapter 2. The reason why Iran relies on proxies or non-state actor is because in conventional military terms, Iran has no choice, has absolutely no chance of dealing with the US. Absolutely no chance. But if they rely on asymmetrical warfare strategies, they could have a little chance. Most people just focus on the disparity of power in terms of economics, in terms of military power, in terms of political power. What I discovered is that there is another level that is absolutely devastating to Iran. That is, we know so much more about Iran than Iran knows about the United States. Not just about its culture, but about what the US is doing in the Middle East. And that, I think, was the greatest surprise I had. There are so many beautiful, fantastic books written about the Islamic Republic, about the Islamic Revolution, pro and con. Find me 5 or 6 or 7 books written by Iranians about the US. I was having an interview with a major Iranian newspaper a couple of weeks ago, and I told him, I said, can you identify 5 Iranian experts of America? Can you identify 2 books that have been written about US policy by Iranians in Iran? Maybe there are 1 or 2 senators, 4 or 5 experts, Iranian experts, but the knowledge we have on Iran is so much superior to the knowledge Iran has about the US, about its foreign policy, and about what it does. So that's my greatest surprise.
Interesting. And what about the second part of that? Was there any views that you held going into this that your research made you reconsider or reshape?
Yes. And that might be a little bit difficult for me to admit, but as I started writing the conclusion, and as I talked to a lot of friends who had different views about Iran, I realized that the opposition to the Islamic Republic in Iran is much more extensive, much deeper than what I had thought. This is why the concluding paragraph of the book is about the challenges that the Islamic Republic faces, because we have a young, vibrant, fantastically educated youth population in Iran. For those of you who identify Iran with Islamic veil and with oppression, there are more Iranian women in Iranian universities than men by 5 to 8%. 5 to 8%. And it is one of the most educated youth population in the Middle East. And they use the internet much more frequently, and the data is available. Per capita, Iranians use data more than anyone else in the Middle East except the Israelis. So you have a young population, educated population, and then you have a government that is trying to rule based on Islamic principles. They are not compatible. Somehow there has to be a change. And that's why at the end, I became much more convinced that unless the Islamic Republic, unless they change the way they operate, they are not going to be able to survive, regardless of what they do in foreign policy. Because Tip O'Neill summarized it all. He said, all politics is local. All foreign policy is local. If you have a government that does not have the support of its population, that government cannot sustain its rule, regardless of what it does in the region. Iran has achieved a great deal in the region, no doubt about it. Expanding power is difficult, but in the international arena, sustaining that power is even more difficult. And we already have seen how the Iranian power has declined considerably. And later on, I'll talk about why I think the Iranian power has declined.
So a group of smart young people who are opposing a government that they think is not working in their interest. Sounds familiar. What would you say is different about the current situation than it was back in '79?
I think the question is, do I think Iran is on the verge of another revolution? My answer is no. And I could be wrong. Things could change. Things are dynamic. Iran is on the verge of transformation, yes. Iran is on the verge of radical change, perhaps, but not revolution, because revolution is very different than societal change, than societal transformation, than coup d'etats, than change from above. Revolution essentially means that people who have no power, who are not part of the governing elites, form an alliance from different classes in society, and then they try to change the structure of the government. They come out with a new constitution. You see new leadership. That is not likely to happen. Now, why? There are a number of reasons. First and foremost, when you go back to 1979, nobody thought the Shah is going to be easily overthrown. No one. Everybody knows that President Carter, who recently died, and God bless him, he was the best former president we had, but not so good as a president. He wrote in his memoir that as late as November 1978, that's 3 months before the Shah was overthrown, the CIA, supported by other American agencies, told him that the Shah is safe. He is going to stay in power for another decade. And then 3 months later, Ayatollah Khomeini overthrew the Shah. What happened there? I don't want to go back to 1979, but here is what I can tell you about 1979. The Shah lost the revolution because A, he was able to modernize Iranian economy. He was able to initiate impressive economic and social development in Iran. I happen to be the product of that development. Nobody can deny that. The Pahlavi regime, the Shah's regime, modernized Iranian society, did a lot of good for Iran. Economically, socially, educationally. However, the problem is that when you push a society toward economic development, but you don't allow the political institutions to grow, you create a disparity, you create an imbalance, and that imbalance can easily be erupted into revolution. That's what happened. The Shah had initiated a modern economy, but the way he ruled was based on his personal dictate. Admiral Bayless is here. He knows about the military more than anyone else. I was reading a memoir of one of the Shah's general, and he was telling us that the Shah used to make the decisions that somebody at a much lower rank should have been allowed to make, because he wanted to be in control. He wanted to be in control of the entire system. And then when he was struck with cancer, and then the opposition started rising up against him, he showed indecisiveness. In times of revolution, in times of crisis, you need decisive leadership. I think it is much better to make wrong decisions when you're confronted with an aggressive opposition than make no decisions. Not only he was indecisive, Jimmy Carter was indecisive. He didn't know what the hell was going on. One day he would push the Shah to open up. The next day he would urge the Shah to suppress the opponents. So the Shah lost the revolution. And now we have a society that is much more unhappy with its government than the Iranians were in 1979. So the question is, then why are we not going to have a revolution? Because in order to have a revolution, A, you need a leader who can unify diverse groups of society, not just one class, but diverse groups. Khomeini did that. He was a religious man. People trusted him. He was an old man. Everybody thought that he's not going to live forever, so he's going to be in power for a few years. But he was able to unify the workers, the middle class, the modern middle class, the merchants, students, communists, you name it. He unified them. We don't have such a leader today, number one. But the most important difference is this. The Shah was indecisive and unwilling to kill its opponents. We have a government that believes is representative from God. They will feel no compunction in destroying their opponents. And you have a government that has been able to institutionalize. It is not based on one man. It is based on many different institutions. This government is much more repressive than the Shah's government. But that's the story of all revolutions. You cannot show me a single revolution that did not create a more repressive, a more authoritarian government than the one that it overthrew. It happened in France. It happened in Russia. It happened in China. It happened in Cuba. So you have a society that is very unhappy, but you also have a government that believes in itself, is confident, and is willing to kill. But there is one other element. In 1979, when I was watching what was taking place in Iran, I had no example of what revolution is. It was an abstraction. You know, I heard about Fidel Castro, Che Guevara. Well, yeah, revolution. Believe me, revolution is no good. It's never been good. And it will never be good, because revolution is an attempt to find a shortcut. And in life, there are things that has no shortcut. You got to go through the process. But the fundamental difference is that the Iranian people have seen what the 1979 revolution has done to them. Moreover, when they look around, what do they see? They see nothing but death and destruction in Afghanistan. The regime change in Afghanistan, what did it produce? What did it produce in Iraq? What did it produce in Syria? What did it produce in Libya? So they are a little bit more cautious. The Iranian middle class has become more cautious. 2 years ago, we had this incredibly impressive movement spearheaded by women against Islamic veiling. It lasted for about 5 months. At least 600 people were killed. 20,000 people were imprisoned. And yet, it wasn't able to really shake the foundation of the Islamic Republic. Why? Because other segments of society did not join the protesters. They wanted to know, what kind of plan do you have for me? Yes, this is a bad regime. I'm willing to overthrow it. But what are you going to replace it with? That is the greatest lesson I learned from the Iranian Revolution. That when you want to overthrow something, ask yourself, what am I replacing it with? Destroying things is very easy. I can put a couple of dynamites in this building and Don't report me that I'm going to do that. I'm giving you an example. And we can destroy this building. Try to build it. Revolution is difficult because it has to involve both destruction and construction. The destruction part is easy. The construction part is difficult. And therefore, the Iranians are a little bit more worried. But that doesn't mean change is not coming. That system has to change. It will change. And it's not going to take a long time before it changes. It's going to happen very shortly.
Thank you. That's a great analysis of the history of revolutions and its applicability to the current situation in Iran. You say as your conclusion that Iran's rise is not really sustainable, and that's due to a variety of internal and external pressures. And we've talked about some of the internal dynamics that have been brewing. Let me just sort of look forward here for a minute. As you know, the Council on Foreign Relations released a report recently. It's called the Preventive Priority Surveys. Basically, this is just, they asked a bunch of foreign policy experts what geopolitical events they were most worried about potentially happening in 2025. And one of the things at the top of that list, meaning they thought it was high likelihood and high impact, those were the two criteria for what hit the top, was concern about an escalation of the conflict between Iran and Israel that might actually involve attacks on energy and nuclear facilities, and that might lead to a wider instability in the Middle East and potentially deeper U.S. involvement. I'm interested in your thoughts on that, on the likelihood of that happening, how you think something like that, a contingency like that might play out, or why you think it won't.
I'm happy you asked that very easy and non-sensitive question. I appreciate that. But here is what I think. Iranian regional policy has been against Israel from the get-go. Ayatollah Khomeini had a long legacy of opposition against Israel. In fact, when he was exiled in 1963, one of his complaints to the Shah was that you become too close to Israel. Iran never recognized the state of Israel, although it de facto recognized Israel. Iran was the second country in 1948 that recognized Israel. And the relationship between Israel and Iran was extremely friendly. As a matter of fact, Savak, the secret police of Iran, the feared Savak, was created with the help of the American CIA and Israeli Mossad. Iran provided oil, and the Israelis provided some kind of weapons. Not advanced, but because the US was the main provider of weapons to Iran. In fact, from 1971, this is one of my favorite statistics about Iran and the US. From 1971 to 1979, on the eve of the revolution, 25% of all US military sales. Ladies and gentlemen, please pay attention, because that's what it means when we say countries have no friends, they have only interests. From 1971 to 1979, 25% of all US military sales went to Iran. 25%. So Israel was a friend of Iran, and then the revolution came and Iran pursued anti-Israeli policies. And the Israelis also pursued anti-Iran policies because Iranians looked at Israel as American ally. They were in a Cold War with the United States, and therefore Israel was also a target for Iran. Bibi Netanyahu, for the past 20 years, has been complaining about the danger of Iranian government becoming a nuclear power. Here is what we know. Iran today, I believe, based on everything I have seen, open information, has become a threshold nuclear power. What does that mean? That means Iran has the military, it has the technological, infrastructure, and expertise to build a bomb, should they decide to build a bomb. Now, there are three different phases that involves in building a bomb. First is enrichment of uranium. You got to be able to enrich it up to 96%. You have to have these fast spinning centrifuges, and you have to be able to purify it to 96%. It's very difficult to purify it to 3.7. It becomes much more difficult to go to 20%. But then it's not that difficult to go from 20 to 60, and it's not difficult at all to go from 60 to 90. Iran now is capable of enriching uranium at 60%. And there is no question that they can, if they decide to do it, take care of the enrichment part. But you also need to be able to weaponize that uranium. And you also have to be able, the third element, to be able to carry it and to detonate it wherever you want to do. We don't know much about Iranian capabilities in those two areas. However, what we know, but there is a universal agreement that Iran does have the knowledge. So now the question becomes, what can Israel do? Israel believes that Iran, a nuclear-armed Iran, poses an existential threat to Israel, and that the Iranians are mad people, and they're going to use it against Israel. And therefore, they want to get rid of that nuclear technology. The problem is, how are you going to do that? You can't destroy knowledge unless you go and assassinate every scientist that you have. So you have to bomb it. You have to bomb known facilities. And here is the answer to your question. That's background information. I don't think Israel alone has the capability, military capability, to destroy Iranian nuclear facilities. It needs American technical, logistical, intelligence, and all kinds of support. Most importantly, should there be an attack on Iran, Iran is going to retaliate. And if the US doesn't get involved in preventing that attack, stopping Iranian missiles, as they did a few months ago, we're talking about the regional warfare in the Middle East. Because once you attack Iran, this business that, it's going to be a surgical strike, we're just going to attack a couple of facilities and things are going to be nice and dandy. One thing we all should have learned is that there is something called unintended consequence of wars. We supported the Mujahideen in Afghanistan against the Soviet. Guess what happened? We got the Al-Qaeda. That's the gift, unintended consequence. In 1982, Israel invaded Lebanon. Guess what happened? We got Hezbollah in June 1982. Now, most recently in Iraq, the US invaded and occupied Iraq. What did we get? We got ISIS. So once you attack, starting a war is easy. Containing it and managing it is extremely difficult. This is why I think, that is my take. I could be completely wrong, but I believe President Trump is against a military strike against Iran. I could be completely wrong, but so far, based on everything I have seen, he is against it. Now, the Israelis, of course, want to destroy Iranian facilities. I think I've always thought that the best way to deal with Iranian nuclear threat is through negotiations. One thing I know, and that is a nuclear armed Iran is going to change the landscape of the Middle East in a way that it is hard for people to imagine. However, if it is a threat, the best way to deal with it is through negotiations. And starting a war in the Middle East now, going after Iranian nuclear facilities, is going to create a huge, huge mess for the United States in the Middle East, because Israel cannot finish the job. It needs the United States. And once the United States get involved, just imagine what happens if Iran starts attacking some of the centers associated with the U.S. military. Don't want to use the word here. Imagine what's going to happen to oil markets if Iran starts attacking the countries that have given airspace to American aircraft and to the Israeli aircraft. It's going to be a major, major war in the Middle East, much bigger than Iraq, much bigger than Afghanistan. Remember, Iran is a country of 90 million people, and it's a real country. It wasn't created after World War I by the British and the French. It's a real country, and it's a country that has experienced 8 years of war. It has a huge military, and Iranian geography is not hospitable to tanks. It's not like Iraq where you send your tanks and in 48 hours you reach Baghdad and you overthrow Saddam. It's not that way. You have to go through mountains, and it is going to be tough. And once you start it, I think it's going to spread. It is going to spread. It is true that Iran has lost some of its power in terms of its relationship with the proxies, some of the proxies, but I don't think that's the end of the story. Iran still does have considerable regional influence that it can use. So I hope that, and I've been pushing for that, I hope that the Iranians come to their senses and come to negotiate with the United States and reach an agreement, a peaceful agreement, because if that doesn't happen, it's not going to look good for Iran for sure, and it's not going to be good for the region.
That's great. Thank you. Before we turn this over for questions, I just want to make a sort of observation that one of the things that's so impressive about your ability to synthesize all this information is that attempting to characterize anything that's going on in the Middle East is like trying to hone in on a moving target. And I think about the events that have happened late in your book, or that since your book has been written. The loss of Qasem Soleimani, the weakening of Hezbollah, and of course the fall of the Assad regime. I think the fall of the Assad regime is probably prominent in people's minds, and are sort of interested in what you think the implications of they had been using that as a powerful ally, but also sort of a hub of their operations, and what might the loss of that alliance have? What impact might it have on their ability to influence military operations?
Randy, I have to be honest with you. I remember I was sitting there, and General McKenzie was sitting here in my conversation, and I asked him about the assassination of Qasem Soleimani. My views have changed since, because I saw what happened to Hezbollah, I saw what happened to Hamas in Gaza, and most importantly, I have seen what happened in Syria. Why do I say my views have changed? When I was writing my doctoral dissertation on the causes of the Iranian Revolution, one of my professors asked a fascinating question. Her name is Dr. Nora Hamilton, an expert on Mexican Revolution. She said, Mohsen, you know that in the 1917 revolution, before the revolution took place, Lenin took a train and came to Russia. Tell me, you said that you understand the revolution. Do you think the Russian Revolution would have happened if they would have killed Vladimir Lenin in the train that took him to Moscow, and then a few months later, he launched the Bolshevik Revolution? And my answer, without any hesitation, was that absolutely not. No Lenin, no revolution. Because I happen to believe that it is true. We have all kinds of theories about revolution, all kinds of theories about decline of great powers, rise of great powers. But I happen to believe that occasionally you come across leaders who can change things. Not necessarily for good, but can change things. Some leaders have that capability and some leaders don't. They are charismatic leaders. They have a vision. You could disagree with the vision. You could think that they're terrorists. Whatever you think, that's fine. But they have a vision. Now, Qasem Soleimani was the man behind Iran's rise. This is why I started a book with Qasem Soleimani, because he was a unique man with a unique mission who understood the region better than anyone else. He was fighting there. He was a general that was fighting in the battlefield. He knew the region. He knew the leadership of every organization. And his charisma was something that kept that network intact. And when he was killed, and I say that in my book, this is the beginning of the decline of Iranian influence. And that's how my views have changed. And that decline accelerated with the greatest intelligence operation against Iran in the past 50 years. That's the Israeli pager. When they used pager to eliminate a good number of the leadership of Hezbollah. That accelerated the decline. And then the collapse of the Assad regime accelerated further. Now, that doesn't mean that Iran has completely lost its power. No, it hasn't. Hezbollah is still there, although its military capabilities have been diminished significantly. Hamas is there, but I think not even close to the kind of power it had before. And Syria is in turmoil. But regardless of how bad the situation is, Iran has been kicked out of Syria. So it's a major, major setback for the Islamic Republic. And I hate to say that, but I'm going to say it. That's why I said this rise is not sustainable. That's why I said it is not sustainable. I say, why do you think you can beat the United States? What makes you think, Islamic Republic, that you can beat the United States? And then in addition, you made Israel your enemy. As if that's not enough, you made Saudi Arabia your enemy. Damn it, what do you have to be able to neutralize them? That's why I said, when your ambitions do not match your capability, that's when the decline begins. And there is a lesson for all of the young people here. Don't be too ambitious if you don't have the capability. Relax.
That was very insightful and very helpful. Okay with you if we open this up for a bit for questions?
Absolutely.
So I will try to moderate the questions from up here. We'll try to focus on giving students an opportunity, but also, sort of get some other folks from the community who have questions. And I would just please ask your assistance on two things. One is stay on topic. And the second is please ask a question. Sometimes there is a temptation when you have a captive audience to deliver a lecture that you've been wanting to give and saying inside your head for a long time. And this is not the time to do that. So just focus and questions, and you can get brilliant insights fed out to you by Dr. Milani. So what questions are out there? Sir?
You mentioned on 170 this relation to the sovereignty collapse.
When you have people quoting your pages, you know.
That means I'm in trouble.
I will also try to summarize what he said after
I'll
his.
be in this class as well.
Okay, just make sure you kind of speak up, just so folks can hear you.
You mentioned specifically that Russia and Iran, while being allies and supporting the regime, had divergent futures for Syria. Could you expand on that a little bit, and with hindsight, how that contributed to the collapse?
Yes, excellent question. In 2015, during the Syrian civil war, Qasem Soleimani concluded that the Assad regime is not going to be able to win the civil war. That Assad's opponents are too powerful. They are supported by the US and the Western governments, and most importantly, they are financially backed by the Qataris, by the Turks, by Saudis. And Iran didn't have an air force. Iran had only missiles. So he traveled to Moscow, had a meeting with Vladimir Putin, and in that meeting, they decided that Russia is willing to send its air force to Syria. So with an air force and Iranian backing of its militants, the Afghani Shias, Pakistanis, etc., they can actually change the course of the civil war. And it did. The Russian Air Force really went after what they call terrorists and succeeded quite a bit in changing the landscape. However, as I argue in that book, they had different plans. And I'm not very sure that Iran was wise enough to trust the Russians. Number one, Russia, unlike Iran, has good relationship with Israel. Iran was concerned about the fate of the Syrian civil war because of its importance as a land bridge to send equipment and money to Hezbollah, Iran's most important strategic asset. The Russians didn't have that interest. They just wanted to have a naval base. They just wanted to sell their weapons. And most importantly, unlike Iran, they were not fighting against the Saudis, which Iran was at that time, because Iran was supporting the Houthis. Yes, John, the Houthis. They were supporting the Houthis in Yemen and had good relationship with every major rich Persian Gulf countries, unlike Iran. So they had different views. And once the Israelis started bombing Iranian facilities in Syria, I believe the Russians deliberately did not allow Syria to use its air defense system, allowing the Israelis to easily bomb the hell out of Iranian facilities, military facilities in Syria. You get 5 points for that excellent question.
Terrific. Admiral Bayless.
Well, thank you. I decided to ask a more serious question than I did in the reception, and I know you're thankful for that. So my question has to do with the growing alliance between Iran, Russia, Turkey, what the motivations might be behind that and what the instinct could be. You see almost monthly a growing with conferences and military war games, and it seems to be more military oriented than economic. So I just wonder what your thoughts are. Where is this going?
Yeah. Admiral Bayless, one of the saddest, for me personally, saddest part of Iranian foreign policy is that the more we sanction Iran, the more we isolate Iran, the closer they get to the Russians and Chinese. And I don't want that. I think the future of Iran, Iran should pursue a foreign policy not based on animosity toward the West and the US, nor should it have a policy based on animosity toward Russia. I think Iran should have good, positive relationship with both the West as well as the East. That's the lesson. And I think, and I don't want to start the discussion about Ukraine, but I think that's the lesson that a lot of people eventually are going to draw from what is likely to happen in Ukraine. But my key point is that Iran has become ever closer to Russia as it has become more isolated. In fact, Iran is now talking about the pivot toward the East. America is talking about the pivot toward Asia, and Iran is talking about the pivot toward the East. And the East means essentially two countries. Russia, that provides intelligence and some military hardware. In fact, Iran is reportedly receiving some really good fighter jets from Russia, a good number of them soon, and of course, some limited economic relationship. But China is Iran's major buyer of oil, and Iran really wants to have good relationship with China. But the sanctions don't allow this. The Chinese signed a $400 billion secret deal with Iran. And that $400 billion comes from Financial Times of England. I'm not just using that number. But China has been unwilling to invest in Iran. But anyhow, going back to your question, Turkey is different. Turkey and Iran were on the same side, were not on the same side during the civil war in Syria. Turkey was against Assad. Erdogan has been against Assad from the get-go. But now the relationship between Iran and Turkey is not that good, because the perception in Tehran is that this new government in Syria is Turkish supported and Turkish financed. But Iran is moving ever closer to Russia. As a matter of fact, this evening, Lavrov, foreign minister of Russia, is going to Tehran to talk to its counterpart and to others, partly because some Iranians fear that when Russia and the United States met in Saudi Arabia last week, they made a deal about Iran. I don't think so, but Iranians are famous for having conspiratorial theories. And they made a movie about this called Ayjan Napelon. So that is beyond our discussion today.
Great. Sir?
We saw after the assassination of Soleimani, through Chinese intermediaries, Iran and Saudi Arabia reopened each other's embassies and got closer. Is that Iran attempting to recover from the losses they got throughout the Middle East, or is it just they're trying to do a new page?
No, Iran and Saudi Arabia had a rapprochement before that. The Chinese were the one who mediated that rapprochement. And the reason for it is very simple. Iran started supporting the Houthis in Yemen in order to undermine the Saudis. And to a great extent, they succeeded. The Saudis could not defeat the Houthis. They just couldn't do it. And the Houthis were getting quite a bit of their missiles and their technology from the Iranians. And Iran had established a presence in the Arabian Peninsula for the first time. So the Saudis started undermining Iran in various ways. But ultimately, when the Saudis realized they cannot win the war in the Yemeni civil war, and when the Iranians concluded that their business of just undermining Saudi Arabia does not serve their interests or the national interest of Iran, they tried to have a rapprochement. And I think it's a very important and necessary rapprochement. Saudi Arabia and Iran should not become hostile powers. They should help each other, and along with other countries in the region, and create a strong region. Let me just summarize everything about the question you asked. War is not the answer in the Middle East. We've gone through almost 2 decades of continuous war, endless war. It's time to end it and start on the route of economic prosperity, regional collaboration and cooperation. Now, I guarantee you, none of the major players in the region are going to listen to me or give a damn about my advice.
They need to read your book.
Thank you.
Excellent.
Dr. Milani, thank you very much for this so thoughtful conversation. My question is about Iran's foreign policy. How much of it is domestic policy? Because I have this perception that Iran is kind of trapped in its own domestic policy, which prevents it to advance its international relations and national security objectives. Is that true? And how can Iran overcome that situation? Because mixing domestic politics with international relations, with your national security objectives, can be very dangerous for a nation. So how can Iran overcome that kind of situation, if that's true in your opinion?
The domestic politics plays a key role. And let me explain to you. The United States became interested in Iran after World War II. And when the father of the last Shah of Iran, Reza Shah, was forced into exile, and his son, who was 21 years old at that time, took over, his idea was that I want to bring America to Iran because the United States does not have a colonial background. In fact, it has an anti-colonial background and has no territorial ambitions over Iran. Moreover, the Shah didn't trust the British. I don't blame him. And he didn't trust the Russians because both countries had invaded Iran during World War II, despite Iranian neutrality. Of course, the US did, but he decided the US was okay. The US wasn't willing to get close to him because they didn't want to alienate the British, and the British controlled Iranian oil, and that was the major concern of the United States at that time. But then came the 1953 coup d'etat. And popularly elected government, the government of Dr. Mohammad Mossadegh, was overthrown in a CIA MI6 coup d'etat with the help of a major portion of Iranian clerics and with other elements in the military, in the intelligence, etc. And from that moment, the United States became Iran's strategic ally. And they were able to have about 50% share in the new oil consortium that was established after the overthrow of the Mossadegh government. Until that time, the British completely controlled Iranian oil. And at that time, the company that the British controlled in Iran was the largest British company in the world. Mossadegh nationalized it. Then there was a coup, and the British got only 45% of the new consortium. The Americans got 49%. And from that moment, America became Iran's ally, And Iran became America's allies in the fight against the Soviet Union, because Iran had 1,400 miles of common border with the Soviet Union. The Shah used its alliance with the United States to consolidate power at home and to expand power abroad. Then came Ayatollah Khomeini. Here is the beauty of it all. America today is much more influential in Iran than it was under the Shah's days, but in a very negative way. They're influencing everything through sanctions. But for the Islamic Republic, the key moment came in November 1979, when the American embassy was attacked, occupied by a bunch of delusional and dangerous young men, many of whom were educated in Berkeley, California. And from that moment, Iranian foreign policy changed. Iran and the US became involved in a Cold War, and Iran has been paying heavy price for it. The key point I'm trying to make is that yes, the domestic politics plays the key, because Ayatollah Khomeini used anti-Americanism to defeat its rival. He used anti-Americanism to consolidate power. He used anti-Americanism to create a new theocracy in Iran. When President Carter tried to settle the hostage crisis in Iran, and Arab politicians turned to President Carter, and he said, "Mr. President, don't try too hard. You are going to get your hostages released only when the Islamic Republic is consolidated." And damn right he was.
Others?
All right.
Any additionals? Students looking for extra credit?
No.
Hang on just a second, Jim. Let me get the young lady behind you.
Dr. Milani, how do you think the opening of access and resistance reliance on these non-state actors is not?
How is it going to? I'm not sure if I.
So we've seen Hezbollah weakening, we've seen Hamas weakening. How do you think that the weakening of these different organizations is going to impact their use on them in the future and what they do to kind of put power throughout the region?
Well, I think the key is what is going to happen in the next 6 months. Because in the next 6 months, Iran has to either come to the negotiating table or things are going to get nasty. Not in terms of military attack, that could also come about. But there is something else that is extremely important, and that's the snapback option that the Europeans have. When Iran signed that nuclear agreement in 2015, there is a provision in that nuclear agreement that the European countries, or even China and Russia, if Iran is found in violation of the JCPOA, they can snap back the sanctions against Iran. Right now, the only sanctions that are working against Iran are US unilateral sanctions. But if Iran does not come to an agreement, the UN can impose its UN sanctions, which makes it very difficult for Iran to deal with the rest of the world. So for the next 6 months, we're going to know what is going to happen. In the negotiations, there are people who say that we should negotiate with Iran not only about its nuclear program, but also about two other issues, about Iranian missiles and drones, and about Iranians' regional activities. Iranian defense doctrine is not based on its nuclear deterrence. The most effective component of Iranian defense is its missiles and its drones, specifically its missiles. And that is because during the war with Iraq, the US sanctions forced the Iranians to become self-sufficient. They learned the trick, they learned the technology, and they developed it. And by 2014, the man who spearheaded all of that, who's called the father of Iranian missiles, was assassinated in cold blood in Tehran.
Jim. Yes.
Jim.
You've spoken tonight quite frequently about the Houthis, and I'd ask you to maybe pull on that thread a little bit more because, as you see, Hamas, Hezbollah, a lot of the proxies are sort of on their heels. The Houthis are not. And you talk about how they're threatening Saudi Arabia, but they're also threatening international shipping, and it doesn't seem to be abating. Where does that go?
Well, it is, Jim, I think it is abating quite a bit because the Houthis claim that as long as Israel continues bombing Gaza, they're going to try to disrupt shipping. And they did. The Houthis are authentic Yemeni force. Their branch of Shiism has been operating in Yemen for at least 1,100 years that I know of. And they are great fighters. They're known for their lack of compromise. In fact, one of the major differences between the Shias that the Iranians practice and the Shias that the Houthis practice is because they say that the Iranians compromise too much. They don't. They are great fighters. And unlike what a lot of people say, Iran does provide support to Houthis, but they also have their own sources of weapons. They got it before. They got it from the old military of Yemen, when Yemen was an ally of the United States in the war against terrorism. So I think they're in a good position. But right now, everything is going to depend on what Iran and the US can do in the next few months. I think if there is an agreement, you're going to see the lowering of tension in the Middle East. And I hope that's the case. I really hope that's the case, because Yemen has been destroyed, just like Syria. There was no winner of the war in Syria. Everybody lost. The country is destroyed. 4 million people lost their homes. And some people say, we won. No, you didn't win. Everybody lost. That's why I hope we can prevent another war in the region.
Thank you.
Thank you
Dr.
very much.
Milani, for
Thank
your
you.
time tonight and for your insights and spending so much time and being so generous with your time with questions. Thank you all for coming.